The way quartal chords should be notated has never reached a consensus among musicians. After researching various notational models, I have come up with my own. But first, let's start with the most basic of quartal chord notation. Here is the basic quartal chord, 2/4 stacked on top of each other. As you can see, I have labeled it C7 sus4. This is the most typical thing to see in lead sheets, and it works fine in most contexts, because in most music there isn't much advanced quartal harmony. Really, the only quartal chords you'll be seeing are these ones. It should be noted that in the majority of music, the quartal chord occurs as a dominant chord, so the dominant chord label is fitting for it. The first glaring problem of labeling the quartal chord as C7 sus4 becomes apparent quite quickly. The C7 sus4 could have the G, or the fifth of the chord. However, that would make it no longer a quartal chord. In most musical contexts, this doesn't actually matter that much, because whether or not you include the fifth doesn't change the function and barely changes the sound of the chord. Let me play back the two different C7 sus4 voicings back to back. The first one will be without the fifth, and the second one will be with the fifth. As you can hear, these two sounds are somewhat interchangeable. However, it still doesn't deny the fact that the C7 sus4 as a label lacks specificity. Remember when I said that the C7 sus4 voicing with a fifth was not a quartal chord? I lied. It doesn't have a quartal root of C, but it's still derived from a different quartal chord. As you can see, it's actually an inversion of the G quartal 10 chord. You can get a bunch of unique and cool voicings by taking inversions of a quartal chord. In this case, I put them all in closed position, meaning that all the notes are contained within an octave. I will later make a video on exactly this topic. Now let's move on to my method of naming quartal chords. If you watched my last video on quartal chords, you'll know that I used the letter Q to signify that chord as a quartal chord. Now let's talk about how to notate quartal chords that are more than just 3 different notes. In other words, quartal chords with extensions. Similarly to how we notate the extensions of tertiary chords, we notate the extensions of quartal chords with a number. But instead of going by intervals of thirds for each extension, we're going by intervals of fourths. So it goes from 7, which is implied, so we don't need to notate it, to 10, to 13, to 16, to 19, while a tertiary chord would go from 7 to 9, to 11, to 13, to 16, etc. Now an important observation must be made. If we look at the C quartal 19 chord, you'll notice that has 7 notes. These 7 notes together form the Locrian scale of the root, in this case the C Locrian scale. This is important because this means that all quartal chords with at most 7 notes that are made of only perfect fourths belong to a chord scale, in this case Locrian. This means that the 10th by default is a minor 10th, the 13th by default is a minor 13th, the 16th by default is a minor 16th, and the 19th by default is a diminished 19th, and harmonic to diminished 5th. Now that we have observed that pure quartal chords, or quartal chords only made of perfect fourths, belong to the Locrian scale, we can now look at quartal chords with a tritone in them. So what happens when you make a quartal chord with a tritone and then a perfect fourth? If we take one with the root of C, for example, we'll see that the notes are C, F sharp, and B. And the scale with the root of C that contains those 3 notes is C Lydian. Therefore, we can call this a C quartal Lydian chord. Now we can freely continue to add perfect fourths on top of this chord, and it'll continue to be a quartal Lydian chord, just with a larger extension. like in this case, a C quartal Lydian 13 chord. Let's take a look at another chord with an augmented fourth. Here we have C quartal Ionian 10th. If you notice, the tritone is now between the F and the B. And as you can see, this chord fits into the Ionian scale. Here's a chart I made on how to label any quartal chord with 7 or less notes. If the quartal chord has no tritones, then it's from the Locrian scale, and since that's a default, you don't need to label it. If it does have a tritone, read it from right to left. First search if it fits into a Lydian scale. If not, then move on to the Ionian scale, then to the Mixolydian scale, then to the Dorian scale, the Aeolian scale, and finally the Phrygian scale. You'll notice that some of the note heads of the chords are either black or white. The grouping of white note heads are the minimum amount of notes required to label it like that. So if you can see, the quartal Aeolian chord requires those first 6 white notes to be able to be called an Aeolian chord, while the Ionian and Lydian quartal chords only require those first 3 notes to be able to get those labels. So now you might be wondering, what if the quartal chord has more than 7 notes? How would I name it? Well, you would continue with the numbers. So after 19, you can have 22, then 25, and then 28. However, you might notice that if you have more than 7 notes in a chord, it can't belong in a mode of the major scale anymore. And that would be right, but it doesn't matter because any quartal chord with more than 7 notes will always have only perfect fourths. Therefore, we can just name it with a number and no scale name. This is because once you have 7 notes and you add a tritone on top, you'll actually end up repeating one of the notes you've already used, as you can see highlighted in these examples. Another question about this notation system would be, how would you notate quartal chords with multiple tritones? It should be noted that the vast majority of quartal chords do not contain 2 tritones, because 2 tritones make an octave, so they kind of cancel each other out. However, in a future video, I will discuss quartal chords with multiple tritones. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe and stay tuned for the next video.